Charles Alexander Eastman was a Dakota man, a Santee Dakota man from what's now the state of Minnesota. And his name, if you can try and say this, Ohiesa. Try that, Ohiesa. It means somebody who's victorious, somebody who succeeds, which is really a good name for him because he succeeded so well in his life. So he was born in 1858 in Minnesota, in southern part of Minnesota, which is traditional Santee Dakota homeland. But because of some conflicts that occurred, his family fled to Canada. We call it grandmother's land, Unchimacoche. And so he grew up during his early years in Canada. It's the area where he grew up is a reserve now. It's called Pipestone Creek, which is in the province of Manitoba. It's Manitoba, Canada. And later on, his father's name was Wakahedi Ota. Wakahedi Ota means many lightnings. His father thought maybe his son was dead and went after him and brought him back from Canada back to the United States, where he received education at Flandreau, South Dakota, which is a reservation area. And he didn't know any English at all, no European language at all, but he quickly mastered English, and he did so well that he ended up going to the East Coast, and he graduated near the top of his class from the medical school in Boston, Massachusetts. Now, he was a very successful physician, and he was the physician in charge at Pine Ridge Agency and supervised the care for the victims of the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890. He later went on to become a very, very prolific author, but prior to that, he was one of the co-founders of the Boy Scout movement. He established many, many incredible movements to raise up the indigenous people of the United States. And he was one of the very first, if not the first, indigenous person to write books from an indigenous perspective, history books. And he also wrote many books covering various topics, not just folk tales, but history. He talked about the different social conditions. All of these things he wrote in a very, very powerful, very, very compelling style of writing. Minnesota at the time of Charles Eastman or Ohiesa's birth was going through a lot of transitions because the land was considered very, very valuable by the European immigrants, people coming. So they saw all the riches of that land. And so they, unfortunately, because of different circumstances, the Dakota people lost, or it was forcibly taken, the land and resources, which was their birthright. And so by the time Ohiesa was born, the Dakota people had some small little reservation areas along the Minnesota River. And that's where Ohiesa was born. And unfortunately, in his youth, he experienced a horrific war in which the Dakota people lost so much, and they lost so many of their people. Many of the people were killed in that war. And so many of the survivors of that war fled to Canada for asylum to get protection from the being further victimized. And so this is why his family, he lived with his grandmother in what's now Manitoba, Canada. This is a wonderful book, and it contains stories that are called, and see if you can say this word, Ohunkaka. Ohunkaka, and in English this would be fairy tales. And these are characters which are very universal, but for the Dakota people, some of the characters that are introduced in this story would be, one of them is Iktomi, and as they say in the Santi dialect, Unktomi. And so Iktomi is a trickster character. Iktomi means spider. And so instead of like weaving real webs like a spider weaves the cobwebs, but Iktomi weaves webs of trickery and deceit in order to ensnare and to get the best of his victims. And so this is what Iktomi does. His whole focus is just creating mischief and chaos, because he represents that ego, the human ego. So they tell these stories to warn us how not to behave. So there's quite a few of the Iktomi stories here. Also, they have other characters such as Anuchite. Anuchite means double face. So this is also something that people can be trapped by too, as those who might have one face which is good, and then they've got another face which is bad. So they can show both sides, but we can be ensnared in those tricks as well. Another character, like they have these famous characters such as Weotra Hukshila, who is the blood clot boy. He's the avenger. He's the one that will always arise in the case of injustice to correct injustices. So this is another character. Now these are not characters that only Dakota people have, but they're very universal. They also have characters called Chaotina. And these Chaotina are the little people who live in the forest, or forest dwellers. So you can probably already think about how some of these are parallel or analogous to stories that we hear in our English language. Maybe such as leprechauns. You've all heard of leprechauns. These small people live in the forest. Another comparison would be to the trickster character would be maybe the big bad wolf. You've all heard of the big bad wolf and stories like Little Red Riding Hood, or maybe Three Little Pigs, or maybe the Peter and the Wolf. There's many stories about the big bad wolf. Another character that you hear about are these wizards. And one of the wizards that we have in the Dakota tradition is Wazia. There's others as well. And there's also these witches too. So they're all very, very universal characters. So they teach us many things. And of course, one of the main type of stories that is in Wigwam evenings are fables. These are also called Ohunkaka stories because they're fantastic stories. They're from a time when we could communicate with the animals and we could understand intimately the ways of the animals. So these fables are also Ohunkaka stories, and they teach us what are called morals. So the way that the animals interrelate with each other. They teach us many good lessons about how to act properly, how to behave, how to be virtuous in our lives. And so there are many of these kind of stories in here as well. These stories, these Ohunkaka stories, they have no beginning. There's no beginning. As long as people have lived on the earth, just like Smoky Day, the people gather around that fireplace, the little kids are there, and they've listened to stories. This is one thing that all people on the earth share, is that at one time, we all gathered around the fire. You might be of European ancestry, maybe your ancestors are from Africa, wherever they're from, you can be assured that they all came around that fireplace, and the elders spoke to them, told them how to express themselves, taught them how to sing, and above all, taught these things through stories, through the stories. So it's all so universal. It's so ancient. There's just no beginning, and also there's no end to it. And you'll love every one of them.